If I were to die tomorrow, would I still want to be doing what I'm doing today? And what do you think happens to the body, to the soul? Where do we go? Do you believe in an afterlife, a heaven and a hell? The number one top regret of the dying is wishing they had lived a life more authentic to who they were.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hot Flash Health Podcast, where we're dishing out unfiltered truths about menopause with a side of sass and a sprinkle of crass. Get ready to dive into the wild world of hot flashes, mood swings, and all the other joys of being a teenager. This ain't your grandma's podcast. We're here to chat about our bodies, passions, fears, and desires, all while navigating this roller coaster ride of menopause. So grab a glass of wine, coffee, water, whatever you fancy. Kick back and let's ride this hot flash wave together. I'm Courtney Mamusha. Alongside me is my fabulous co-host, Dawn Fable. We're just two outspoken gals who aren't afraid to say it like it is. Now let's kick off today's episode. Dawn, why don't you go ahead and introduce today's amazing guest who we got to meet together.
Oh, gosh. Oh, gosh. All right, Hot Flash fam, buckle up because today we are tackling a topic that most of us avoid like the plague, death. But hold on, because before you hit pause, trust me, this conversation is going to be anything but grim. We've got the powerhouse guest here to flip the script and make us talk more about the big D as empowering as a killer pair of heels. Joining us is the fabulous Maura McInerney-Rowley, founder and CEO of Hello Mortal. Maura's journey from heartache to hope after losing her mom to breast cancer has led her to become a leading death doula and total boss babe in the world of end-of-life care. She's on a mission to take death out of the shadows and into the light, turning what's often seen by so many of us as taboo into celebration of life itself, which certainly I could be doing better. From exploring death archetypes, yes, they're a thing, to creating thoughtful, intentional end-of-life plans, Maura's here to help us face mortality with grace, sass, and a whole lot of intention. So today we're diving into how contemplating death can actually make life richer, how we can kick the death anxiety to the curb. I know it's certainly something that I struggle with, and why we need to start talking about such an important topic as we're all in the sandwich generation of taking care of our elderly parents and end-of-life care like yesterday. So we feel very fortunate to welcome Maura today. We met at a female founder event, and I was so inspired and curious in what it is that you do. And so we're so happy to have you here. Thank you so much, Maura, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. That intro is so flattering. It was so nice. Thank you.
You deserve it. Let's dive into your journey. I know that you started kind of event planning in Aspen and then became a death doula. It's really fascinating. So maybe you can share with us how your experiences with grief and mortality have shaped your mission with Hello Mortal.
Yes. So I started my career as a wedding coordinator in Aspen, which was quite the experience. And that was coming off, though, the fresh grief of losing my mother when I was in college at 20 years old. And it was a really hard experience for me moving to a new place, graduating, and starting my career while facing that loss. And it was working in the wedding industry that became too much for me at one point, just watching all the brides walk down the aisle with their father, their mother, and having their family surround them at this milestone moment was a lot to handle. And so for many reasons, though, that being one of them, I ended up leaving the wedding industry. And so that experience, losing my mom, working in the wedding industry, and then a more recent experience going into the second year of business school sort of led me to this calling to found Hello Mortal. And so that recent experience was actually, I was attending a wedding as a guest, but I was there to read a poem about lost loved ones because the bride and I had met in Aspen and bonded over the fact that we'd lost parents at the same age. When on the morning of the wedding, we found out that one of the guests had unexpectedly died. And so you can imagine it's your wedding day, it's the most joyous day of your life, and you find out that one of your guests, a dear friend of yours, has suddenly died. And so it was quite shocking. It sent my mind into a flurry of questions, emotional, logistic, about were they even going to have the wedding, and how are they going to send this man's body home to his home state of Massachusetts, where we were in Colorado. And it was the juxtaposition of the death at the wedding that got me thinking about how similar weddings and funerals actually are, but that we view them as polar opposites of the spectrum when it comes to life events. But their core is bringing people together and celebrating a life. And then after the wedding, 24 hours, I was in Alaska backpacking, where I had a week to reflect on this experience, my own mortality, the experience of losing my mother. And I just truly was reveling in the beauty of nature and how fleeting life is, and went back to business school, where I had to pitch an idea in one of my classes. And I ended up pitching this concept of wilderness hospice care, because at the end of the day, how beautiful would it be to spend your final moments in nature? And I was thinking a lot about how my mother died on hospice in our own home, and just how she would have enjoyed seeing a view of the ocean. And while dying at home has its own benefits, certainly being in the wilderness is quite a different experience. So that all sort of led me to where I am today, just following that curiosity and a calling, because it kept leading me down this path of weddings and events and funerals and death.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for sharing that story with us. And first and foremost, we're so very sorry about the loss of your mother.
I'm already tearing up here.
I'm certain that she's so proud of you, looking down, and what a gift, how admirable that you have turned this tremendous loss into a gift of consoling others during this transformative point in our life at end of death. It's interesting because you talk about transforming the denial of death into a celebration of life. How do you believe, Maura, that death teaches us how to live more deeply and live more fully? Because I know that I certainly could do a better job of really embracing that. I think we get so caught up in the busyness of the everyday life that we forget that, as my mom says, every day is truly a gift. Mm-hmm. But until you face death in the face, I don't know that any of us really recognize that.
Yeah, it's death is life's greatest teacher, I think. And I'll say one thing too, just about what we were talking about before. I already cried this morning. So yeah, all my tears might be used up, but that's because I'm in a really unique situation right now, where I'm recently engaged and I'm planning my own wedding. Yeah, so fun, but it's bringing up a whole lot of grief. So we can maybe touch on that, but it's beautiful for me to be able to help people through these challenging moments, having worked in both the wedding industry and now in the funeral industry, so to speak, and navigating people through life's, milestone moments. But I think there's such a profound simplicity in contemplating your mortality. It quickly brings us back to the present moment. I often used to make fun of people who had like the live, laugh, love signs in their house, but like they truly understand the meaning of life. Like that's what we're here to do. And again, a unique perspective of I'm almost a little over a decade out from losing my mother. And so sometimes I find myself forgetting how raw and painful her death actually was. There are certain memories and milestones that come up where I do, but death rocks you in a way that just no other event will. So I really empathize with people who struggle to contemplate mortality or haven't gone through that situation. It's hard to just truly know until you go through it. But I urge people to contemplate mortality before a crisis comes around so that we can be a little bit more prepared. And I think when we contemplate mortality and we think about death, we're able to just prioritize what truly matters in our life, whatever that is for you. There's no right or wrong answer, but it's a way of really reflecting on, okay, if I were to die tomorrow, would I still want to be doing what I'm doing today? In the words of Steve Jobs, who used it as a tool every single day of his life once he was diagnosed with cancer. And yeah, it just has so much to teach us.
Like I've obviously dealt with, I think we've talked about this, but I've lost both of my parents, and I'm looking at the, calendar, and everything you're saying is resonating with me, but it's like their birthdays, not only their birthdays are next week, but their anniversaries of their death are next week. So next week is going to be really challenging for me. But I wanted to talk a little bit about grief. I know I'm diverting a little bit, but as somebody, who knows grief like you and I and others listening, losing a best friend, losing a coworker, losing a parent. I mean, there's these really hard struggles, and it's been 4 years since my dad passed, 2 years since my mom, and I'm still struggling. There's days that I really don't want to get out of bed, and we've talked on other podcasts about the freeze mode that we just talked. Like I can't do things. So maybe somebody who's coaching people around grief. Do you have any good tips on how to kind of like accept this as a process and communicate it to others? Because I know like my husband doesn't understand what I'm going through. So I'm assuming as you're working with people who are dealing with grief and loss, that you have some tools that might be helpful for others to like really know it's okay, and it's okay to share and feel these feelings.
Yeah. I mean, first, I would just say to anyone listening, like, whatever you're feeling is completely valid, completely normal, completely natural. Grief shows up in so many different ways. Common misconceptions that it follows the 5 stages and that it's linear. It's totally not. It's a roller coaster. um, and we just don't really talk about it a lot in our society. And so I think, speaking from personal experience, there were times where I was like, is something wrong with me? Or, there can be a lot of guilt associated with grieving, because when you feel moments of happiness, you think, oh, I shouldn't be happy. Like my parent or my best friend just died. Like, what's wrong with me? So it's like a lose-lose situation sometimes when you're grieving. And it's funny you mention tools, because actually on our radar is to create grief archetypes for people, just in the way that I have for death archetypes. And it's something I'm really excited about building as a free resource to help people sort of explore their grief, because it's for me it's such a personal journey, because it depends on what your relationship was like with that person, what your relationship is like with yourself, and your relationship to mortality, and just where you are in that time of life. I think anyone who is grieving, I would encourage them to just find what works for them, whether that's one-on-one therapy, whether that's group sessions. I loved personally connecting with other people my age at the time, because they felt really isolated. For some people it's not for them, but and also like non-conventional or alternative grief processing methods, whether that's hiking outdoors or literally going to fly across the country or the world to a specific destination that was meaningful for you, to encourage people to think creatively. And that, while therapy is a wonderful tool, it's not the only tool to help you process.
Yeah. Oh, you know, I just was at a girls' night with probably 30 or 40 women on Saturday, and I walked in and I made the joke like, "Oh my gosh, it's a bunch of sophisticated cougars sitting around talking about, life's topics." And someone said to me, "Yeah, it's heavy. We find these days we're talking about, our parents dying and colonoscopies, right?" And unfortunately, as a middle-aged woman, I'm 46 years old. There's so much discussion around being in that sandwich generation, right? We're caring for our children while we're also caring for our aging parents, and unfortunately, death is inevitable. You do such a beautiful job, Maura, through Hello Mortal, offering various tools like death archetypes and the death plan. Can you speak about each one of those and how these tools are helping individuals and families approach death and end of life planning, if that's something that they're experiencing right now, or perhaps something to think about in the future?
Yeah, definitely. And one thing I'll say before I do is just around the topic of for grief milestones and anniversaries, because I think one common misconception I had around grief too was early on was that at some point it would end, but that it never ends, and that's okay. That can sound really scary, but if you think about it in the frame of stealing from Andrew Garfield, that grief is just love with nowhere to go. It's just unexpressed love. And so it's like, what can you pour that love into? And for a while, I would really dread the death anniversaries and the birthdays. I mean, my mom's birthday is December 3rd. I'm December 6th, very close together. She died in October. She died of breast cancer. October's breast cancer awareness month. Like, I was just like, I fucking hate the fall.
I
But
get it.
yeah, you get it. And so I tried to, at one point, I was like, I realized I was mad. I was like, why aren't we celebrating mom? Why aren't we celebrating her birthday? Why aren't we going out to dinner? Why aren't we doing something? So if you're feeling that way, or if you're just feeling, because it's fine to feel sad, like that's totally normal and a part of grief. But I started to try and channel my grief into ways that I felt were talking about more celebratory, and just like and that was a journey over many years. But I just wanted to share that tidbit, and it sort of flows into death archetypes and the death plan, because the reason I created Death Archetypes was just I felt this creative need to build something that I wished I had when I was going through this process of just better understanding myself, better understanding what was happening, better understanding, like, what do I even think happens after we die? Like, many of us haven't even asked ourselves that question, especially if you're sort of non-religious. Like, what do you think happens to the body, to the soul? Where do we go? Do you believe in an afterlife, a heaven and a hell? So I just started asking myself those questions, and it's really meant to be a tool for discussion. And it's used to ask these questions, confront death in a way that feels more friendly and approachable through a personality test that we're all used to taking and enjoy taking, and then connecting with people who share the same archetype as you, similar beliefs or views on the world. And the thing I love most about the archetypes is that they're fluid, so they can change over your lifetime based on your experiences, based on your beliefs, and where you're at. There's no you were born in December, so you're a Sagittarius. It's much more fluid than that. And recently we've been hosting dinners where we take the test and then discuss death archetypes over dinner with discussion prompts in an urn that we pass around. And so it sounds wild, but truly some of the most fascinating conversations I've been a part of happen at those dinners. And then I can get into the death plan, but I'll just stop there in case there's any comments or anything.
Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm glad I'm not alone, because I really appreciate you saying about the grief thing. Like, I also took the same approach where I was like, I don't want to have the day that my parents died being a sad day. Of course, it's sad, but I also tried to transform that into, and on my calendar, it says celebration of dad, celebration of mom. So I try and do things that day that they would do or we did together, like their favorite foods. I'll go out to eat. So I just wanted to, thank you about that. And I think that's really important. And also, like, I kind of want to go have a death archetype
Yeah,
dinner with you. Like, how cool does this sound? I think we should do a little
we
menopause and
should.
death
Yeah.
archetypes gathering. But I do want to hear about the death planet.
Yes, we should do dinner. So death plan, still working on the name, life plan, death plan. It's really interesting when you're in this space and understanding, like, for me, when I'm thinking about who are my users, and that there's such a barrier to entry because people don't want to discuss this. Branding and copy and marketing, everything, what you call something is so important. And I love the death of it all, because it's just straight to the point, because why beat around the bush? And so this plan is a structured way for you, for individuals, families, to really contemplate mortality and outline end of life wishes. And that's from medical care to funeral rituals to legacy letters. And this is something that is often done in isolation or not done at all. It can be very fragmented. Sometimes you're doing advanced directives with a doctor. Sometimes you're doing funeral planning with a funeral home, and legacy projects you might be doing on your own. And so I wanted to create something that wraps all of those nicely together, that combines education and community. So the death plan can be done in a group cohort, it can be done solo, and we're working on creating a self-paced version so that you can do it at your own pace at any time. But Death Archetypes and the Death Plan, they're both tools that are meant to encourage these conversations and provide some sort of sense of agency in an area where I think people often feel powerless, because we all know we're going to go, but we don't know how or when. And it also just provides a gift. It's like a practical gift I think you can give your younger loved ones, whether you have friends or children or siblings. So it takes the guesswork out of it, if when someone dies and you don't know whether what they want, cremation or a burial, or I've seen a lot of unfortunate situations happen where a family not only loses a loved one physically, someone dies, but then the people left, there's an emotional death in the family. Siblings stop talking to each other because people were fighting over what medical accommodation someone should have. And that just breaks my heart, when it's like your family is still there physically, but you're no longer talking to each other because of it. And
Throw money in the mix, and
throw money in the mix, all of it. Yeah. And
sad.
people say, oh, that'll never be me, that'll never be us, but it is you, and it happens, and it's unfortunate. Yeah.
That's such an incredible tool that you're offering, because I think when it comes to this type of thing, people don't know the first of where to go, and everything is so fragmented, like you said, with the healthcare system of advanced directives and funeral homes of, cremation or burial, and not to mention, having those conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's totally overwhelming. So the goal here is to make it feel a little bit easier to start doing, and we do that just through conversation and simple questions of, like what do you imagine happens, and stuff like that.
Well, I feel like I need to take a Xanax and pour myself a super stiff cocktail, because Maura, is when you and I met, that was the conversation. Is I asked what you did, and you shared with me, and I said, I am terrified of death. And you were really kind in seeing me and listening to me, and saying why. So leading into that subject matter, how does death anxiety, I know I can speak from my experience, and I'm sure Courtney can speak from hers, but how does death anxiety shape our everyday lives? And how do I'm an anxious person in general, medicated for anxiety, have been, struggled with it for many years because of the ability of not being able to control the outcome. We can't get around that with death. So how in the hell do you help people like me who are petrified of not only myself dying, but parents dying or loved ones dying? And I mean, this is a heavy thing, because it's something that's very consuming for me on an everyday basis.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And I say, first of all, when I do have these conversations and whatnot, I'm going to say this in a joking manner, but I think it's best to have these conversations over dessert, over something that brings you joy, to remind yourself of the pleasures of life, but that it's impermanent. And I think it's completely normal that people are afraid and anxious of death. Would probably be strange if you weren't, but that even I, have a fear of death. Like, I don't want to die. I know that I will. I know that it's natural, and I'm coming to terms with it through contemplating it every day and having these discussions. But there's so much life to be had and so much richness in it. But I do think that there's a missed opportunity when we avoid thinking about death. When we do that, we deny ourselves the opportunity to contemplate what truly matters to us on a like life or death situation, and then really prioritize that. And I say it because the number one top regret of the dying is um, wishing they had lived a life more authentic to who they were, or having the courage to live the life that they truly wanted to lead. And so often we live life on autopilot, or in shoulda, woulda, couldas, what society deems as a good life, and following those paths. And it can be difficult to go against the grain, and to go out on your own, or follow those passions. But contemplating death, I think, empowers us to live in alignment with our values. And it also can help us, if we don't address it on like the far end of the spectrum, can prevent us from fully engaging in life. So folks who are too afraid to, drive a car or ride a horse or go on a roller coaster ride, like on the far end of the spectrum, it can really be a challenge for a lot of people. But for most people, it's subconscious, because we tend to avoid it. We don't tend to think about it. And when we do bring it up, we're like, yes, it's scary, and I don't want to talk about it. So we just are denying ourselves this opportunity to really dig deeper and explore of like, wow, in the face of impermanence, like, who am I and what do I want out of this one precious life?
Yeah, that's super powerful. And I also concur that after you face this death, I became like a yes person. So if anybody's like, "Do you want to
Yeah.
take this trip?" I'm like, "Yes." Like my dad's final words in his journal were "Carpe diem." Like I have a sign that my friend printed for me over there, "Carpe diem." So I kind of live by that right now. That just seize the day and make things magical and special. So enough about me. Let's go back to you.
Well,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, extending on that, like tips or tools if you're afraid of it. It's just about, like an analogy I like to use is swimming in the ocean or deep water, learning to swim. Like at first it seems really scary and terrifying. You don't know what's lurking under there. You need a life vest, and then you graduate, but it's like just dipping your toe in the water and getting comfortable. And you do that just through reading a book, having a conversation, going to a death cafe, taking your death archetype, listening to a podcast. Like all of these things are tiny little steps that over time build up to the point where you're like, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to make a plan. I'm ready to share it with someone. At the end of the day, death is inevitable, but it doesn't make it any less scary for the most part.
Oh, I mean, I've heard of cat cafes, but death cafes is a
Yes,
new
cat,
one for
yeah,
me.
yeah.
Let's talk about your experience. I think for all of us, death is just something that we typically we can't plan, right? Somebody passes when they pass. So there's a lot of quick planning that comes with planning a funeral. Like your mother's is just a short time frame that you have to figure everything out, and you're emotionally drained, compared to what you're dealing with right now, the process of planning a wedding that takes months and months and months, and you're kind of doing all the things to prepare. So how can we really shift our perspective to viewing the end of life planning with the same level of importance of preparation?
Yeah, I think it's probably the biggest challenge I have in trying to help encourage this cultural shift to view end of life planning as important and necessary. I think it's incredibly essential. We will all grieve in our lifetimes, whether it's over a person or not, just your identity, a house, a home. We'll all grieve, we'll all die. And because of that fact, it should be important. But I think that's where we need to start shifting, not viewing death as some morbid thing, but actually as a natural and celebratory time of life. It's also why I'm super fascinated and interested in the concept of living funerals, because I think so much of it is sometimes can be a little ego driven, like a wedding you're there for, you get to participate in, everyone gets to see you, and whether bride or groom or whomever, all dressed up and have fun and drinks and food. But a lot of people I hear when I talk to them about end of life planning, they're like, oh, well, I'll be dead, whatever, it doesn't matter. And I'm like, well, it does matter, and it matters to the people you leave behind, and there are emotional, financial, and physical implications of your death that you're probably not aware about. And I think if you were, you would maybe have a different attitude. But that really, in order to have this shift, and I think it's happening with the rise of the death positive movement, we just need to continue normalizing these discussions and educating people. It's a lack of education. People aren't aware of what happens when you die and the process that people have to go through after, like probate, if you don't have things in order. And that also there's new innovations in the death care industry, such as body composting, in this green and natural burial movement. So it really is just a group of people who are pounding the pavement and saying, let me talk to you about this. Let's talk about death. And I think that'll continue to evolve, especially since now we have people like Brian Johnson on the total end of the spectrum who are trying to cure death and become immortal, essentially. He's a tech billionaire. So with that in the conversation now too, and super intelligence, AI, like it's starting to become, you can't really ignore the fact. So I think we'll see it more and more in our culture.
Oh my gosh, I have so much to say about that. First of all, I love it how you talked about not only grief of when we die or when we lose our loved ones, but grief of ourselves while we're living, right? Grieving somewhat of our identities. And I think when we as women are approaching this middle-aged stage of our life and menopause and aging children and all of those things, I think there's a real grief process that's happening with us right now in grieving the people that we were and grieving the people and sort of embracing and awakening the people that we're becoming. So I love that point. On the living funeral, I think that's fascinating. Court, there's so much that I would love to say to you as a very dear friend while you're living as to why you're so amazing and why people love you. And we as human beings don't take the time to do that while our loved ones are living. It's not until they die that we carry on the legacy of how wonderful they are and how thankful we are of them and how they have these amazing attributes that change all of our lives. So, God, that's cool. And then thirdly, like menopause, death seems to be sort of a hot topic these days with the movement of death doulas. You're so progressive in that regard, but being able to administer medication for death. There are certainly places in Switzerland, which I have a very dear friend who sent their aunt to be able to die gracefully at their own will. I know that those are varying state by state, and there's certainly a lot of gray area around them, and healthcare is getting involved and the government's getting involved, which seems so crazy because if we want to die, let us die, right? Let us die with dignity.
Yeah, our choice.
But can you speak about some of sort of those trends going on for death?
Yeah, there's a lot. I'm like, we could talk for hours on all of this. In regards to the death doula trend, yes, more and more people are becoming death doulas, which I think is amazing. If you're not familiar what a death doula is, classic definition is someone who provides non-medical care and support to the dying and their loved ones, similar to a birth doula, but just at another phase of life. And it's really someone who's helping you hold space, be an advocate for whatever your decisions are, be that medical aid in dying, and help with end of life planning, ethical wills, and just after death care, such as home funerals and things like that. And then you also mentioned talking about medical aid in dying, which is legal here in Colorado. Yes, also Switzerland, and some other places. It's very controversial. It's similar, it's women's bodies. Like, now we're talking everyone's bodies, like, do we have the right to choose how we want to die, what we want to do with our body? It's a very interesting conversation, a lot of nuance, still a lot of, I think, development to be had around that area. I myself haven't assisted anyone in that. It was not legal in Massachusetts where I was at a hospice, but I know that it does happen here, and I am friends with doulas who do support that and administer that. I'm supportive of people making their own decisions as well. Yeah, I mean, that one's just so interesting when we just think about the conversation of immortality as well, because people are living longer, but they're also not able to afford to live longer or have a decent quality of life. So that throws in a whole other wrench into the topic of conversation. And then I'm blanking on what was the third thing you touched on?
I think it was just really the immersive trends around death and
Yeah.
sort of the movement toward being able to die with dignity, whether that's, administering.
Yeah.
Wait, what is
death.
this body composting? That's what I want to
Oh,
understand.
yes. Well, I was gonna say to that
Green.
lens, like, yeah, that's a very personal choice. If you want to take a pill or whatnot, have death with dignity. Same thing goes for like personalization of these celebrations of life, memorials, funerals. People are adding a whole lot of personality and flair into them, which I absolutely love. And as part of that, there's a couple new options, something called aquamation, water cremation, which is a eco-friendly way to do cremation other than flame cremation, which most people are in tune with. And then there's also body composting or terramation, or also known as natural organic reduction, which essentially turns your body into nutrient-rich soil. So that can be used to plant gardens and donated to conservations and
It's great. My mom's at the garden.
yes.
Court, I love you, but when you die, like, you are not going in my garden.
That's fine.
First of all, I don't even have a garden. Like,
You would
I
if you
might
planted me.
Thread the needle a little bit between weddings and funerals. I just spoke to someone this morning who was telling me at a funeral where they had the body composted, they sent all the guests home with little jars of his soil to go plant flowers. So almost like at a wedding where you get a welcome bag or a take home, this is what they were giving the guests at the funeral to take by choice if they would like. So, and it's very eco-friendly in that matter. It's not necessarily any cheaper than a traditional burial or cremation with a service. They're averaging around like $5,000 to $8,000, but it is a much different process that takes time. So think about, in a traditional or conventional burial where sometimes you have, in my case, it was 2 weeks between, when my mom died and we planned her funeral, and she was cremated, but we still had that compacted service. With composting, you have a much longer time until the body decomposes. So they have these beautiful setups where you go in and it's called a laying in ceremony, and you're there and you're putting in flowers or sentimental items, and then you're actually, you're sort of sending the person off, and then you have about 60 to 90 day period where you can go and visit, or you can start planning a memorial service. There's a bit more space to grieve than some of these other super quick turnaround times.
Wait, what's the water one? I'm really confused how that
Oh,
happens.
so the water one it's called aquamation, and it's been around for a while actually. It was traditionally used, I think, for like farm animals, but it's just a vessel that you put the body in, and it's some sort of alkaline solution that they use, and it decomposes the body in a matter of hours, so not days. It's much faster. And then, I don't know the science down pat, so I won't bore you with those details. But then at the end of the day, like, you have this water that you can actually take and you not drink, but like, because that would be weird. But you can use, they call it, like, one organization calls it tea tree water, and you can put it on plants and whatnot. And then also you're given cremains. So whether you do flame cremation or water cremation, at the end of the day, the bones are still left, and then those are ground down. And aquamation just provides sort of like a finer, softer powder that is a bit more ivory white in color versus flame cremation, which is a bit coarser and more gray.
And heavy. I never knew how heavy it was when, I think my mom's cremation ashes are still in my stepdad's house, and I've like taken a little bit with me some places. Don't turn me in, but
Yeah.
but like it's heavy. That's heavy.
Yeah. And then we're seeing people do all sorts of creative things, like using those cremains to turn into jewelry or to stones or fireworks or paintings. So there's like a whole host of things that you can do.
Well, my mom wanted me to sprinkle some on a joint and roll it up and smoke it, but I still haven't done that. So, there's that too.
Your mom sounds like an amazing human being. The apple does not fall far from the tree.
Yeah. I mean, reflecting on some of your own experiences, what are some of the practical steps you think are crucial for people to start taking in preparation and timing for their own end of life or a loved one? I mean, I'm curious of like, when should we start this?
Yeah. It's never too early to start. The earlier, the better. The healthier, the better. Um, and, let's say I'm speaking to someone who, hasn't really done anything, is not, doesn't have any plans and doesn't really like talking about death. I would say definitely start with the Death Archetypes test, because that is like its purpose through and through, reflective tool, will have you contemplating questions and understanding a little bit more about yourself. And then from there, we provide recommendations for reading. So whatever your method of content, preferred method is, podcast, book, movie, I would say then start there, because there's so many powerful books, films, podcasts that talk about this. And in specific niches too, whether like you have an older parent who has dementia or you have a sibling with cancer, there's a lot of good content out there. And I would start there, and I would start by, okay, again, forming those opinions, like what do I want to have happen to my body, and what do I believe happens to my body, and understanding your choices there. And then once you're ready, I would say start sharing and talking with friends. Like, it's a great icebreaker at a at a dinner party, at a networking event. You say like, hey, I don't really care what you do, but what do you think happens after we die? Like, and would you ever want to be turned into an AI avatar version of yourself? Because that's happening and could potentially happen without your consent. And, if you're on social media, like, do you want your Instagram to still be there? Do you want to post an announcement? Do you want to write it? Do you want someone else to write it? Like, there are all these questions. So I'd say start with Death Archetypes, dip your toe in the water, start finding some content. And then when you're ready, I host monthly death cafes. I call them salons. They're for our Hello Mortal newsletter community. And then, of course, there's the death plan where, you can start crafting plans. I offer free consultations to start if you just want to have a conversation and have questions. And yeah, I think that's the best place to start, is like doing your own research, like what happens and what do I think I believe.
My mind is blown in so many different directions and ways. I thank you for opening up such a important and inevitable circumstance. I think it is absolutely crucial that we have you on this podcast again. I think that there's so many things that we can touch upon: how to talk to our children about death, ways in which we can grieve, which you've spoken about so much today. I'm really interested in sort of the progression of an evolution of how we're dying and the choices of dying. So Maura, you have just been such an incredible resource and so interesting and so vulnerable. And thank you for doing what you're doing, because you are opening up really important conversations. And at Hot Flash Health, that's what we love to do, is connect with people like you to open up those difficult, vulnerable conversations. And give tools and resources, and frankly learn to laugh about it a little bit. Like, death is sad, but I think, as the Indigo Girls once said, if you can't cry yourself to sleep or cry your eyes out, so thank you. Tell our listeners, I know you have incredible tools, a death planning tool, the death archetype, all of those things. Where can our listeners find you to get more of what you offer?
Yeah, well, they can find everything at hellomortal.com. And then I am online, Instagram, Twitter at Maura Ball, so MauraBall. And yeah, everything is under the Hello Mortal website. That's where you can find Death Archetypes, the Death Plan, the consultation with me, and sign up for the newsletter, all under one roof.
Well, we will be signing up, and I can see a lot of joint things in the future. I'd love to chat with you about doing some events with Hot Flash Health. And like John said, just continuing this conversation. Thank you for being an incredible human who, is out there helping people through these challenging times. So with that said, that's a wrap on today's episode. Remember, menopause may be a wild ride, but together we've got this. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Hot Flash Health, and you can stream and subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and Spotify. Be sure to always share your thoughts with us. We love hearing from our fabulous listeners. And until next time, stay sassy, stay fabulous, and keep those hot flashes in check.